Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on History Right podcast. And today we have a debate going on between Professor Dennis McDonald and Professor Bruce Chilton. And they're going to be debating on specifically on two issues. Did Luke know Matthew and Q at the same time? And is Q plus, or the Q plus as Dennis McDonald reconstructs it, is that a better reconstruction than the standard reconstruction of Q? Dennis's position is that Luke knew Matthew and Papias, of what he calls the Q plus Papias hypothesis. So Luke knows Matthew, they both know Mark. All of them know Q. Papias knows Matthew, Mark, and Q. And that's his position. Whereas Bruce takes the standard view that Matthew and Luke are independent of one another and that both of them use Mark and Q. So those are the two things that they're going to be focusing on today. So yeah, thank you both for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
So I'd like to give the first 10 minutes to Dennis to explain the Q plus hypothesis, to explain Dennis, to explain your view and your opening argument to the audience.
Okay. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Bruce. Are you outside, or is that an artificial background for you, Jim?
Yeah. Yes, I'm outside. In this after Labor Day, the weather in the Hudson Valley is absolutely perfect, and I miss as little of it as I possibly can.
Well, I envy you. Yeah. Jacob, I'm actually going to start with things that Bruce and I would both agree on, and then point to points where we may disagree, or at least where I find some unfortunate facts for the traditional two document hypothesis. And then Bruce can come back and tell me if he agrees with some of those considerations or not. The discovery of Q is an extremely important discovery. The problem with Q is that we need to recover it without the benefit of physical artifacts to support our reconstructions. And that means that we need a solid methodology in order to understand this document and reconstruct what we can of it. And by the way, all reconstructions are hypothetical. None is going to be canonical, and nor should it be. But any reconstruction of the Q document offers insights into Christian origins that can't be overlooked. Unfortunately, in my view, the Q document is now in intensive care, and some people would like to pull the plug on it in saying that it's a theory that no longer should be embraced. I don't believe that for a moment, but I do think traditional Q scholarship is up for some retuning or some different kinds of medical treatment so that it's no longer in intensive care. Again, very briefly, let me just say that the discovery of the Q document issued first from scholars over 100 years ago, noticing that Matthew and Luke have strikingly overlapping content they did not receive from Mark. They also noted that sometimes the Matthean version seems to be more primitive in its wording and sequence, and sometimes Luke is more primitive in its wording and sequence. Because these overlapping texts do not appear in Mark, there was a suspicion that Mark did not know that document. And therefore, the traditional Q scholarship attempted to expunge Markan influence on Matthew and Luke as a way of limiting the amount of content that can be attributed to Q by getting rid of what some would call Markan interference or contamination. Now, there are several issues of that I think need to be probed. One is that I think that Luke must have known Matthew, because I think he must have known Papias. And Papias was obsessed with Matthew. In fact, he thought there were two Matthews in Greek. that came from a Hebrew Matthew, and the translators botched it. One of those likely, I think, is the Matthew that we know. And the other, I think, was the Q document, but he also knows Mark. Now, if Luke knows Papias, then he certainly knows of Matthew and may know of Matthew, two Gospels. And I think the second Matthew Gospel was the Q document. So the first question is, can one hold to a Q hypothesis in a reconstruction if Luke knows Matthew? So that would be one piece. Another is we do have a modified two-document hypothesis that's advocated by people like Fladerman, who argues that Mark must have known Q2 because you still have doublets in both Matthew and Luke. You have non-doublets in both Matthew and Luke. You have overlapping content. And you either have to say that there's a robust oral tradition that they both know that is really quite stable, or you have to say that Mark knew Q as well. So the two most troubling issues for many scholars is that Luke knows Matthew. So you have the far hypothesis people that say that Q can be dismissed. You have other people who say that Matthew knows, Mark knows Q, and therefore, or the Q material, and therefore you have a problem in the two document hypothesis. Now, let me give you very briefly my solution. The first is what's called reversed priority. That is, you have a number of places where even if Luke knows Matthew, Luke's content is more primitive, and it appears in a more likely sequence than what one finds in Matthew. So you can say, at least theoretically, and I would say scientifically, that there's material in Luke that he didn't get from Matthew, that he doesn't share with Mark, that comes from somewhere. And there are enough examples of this to establish a database that allows us to get some idea of what the contours and theology and all of that was of the Q document. So that's one cure that saves. And by the way, so much of Q research was in fact on Luke's reverse priority to Matthew. This is not new, but what it's saying is that it is possible that Luke gets some of his parallels from Matthew from Matthew. I don't think that that's entirely a problem, because I don't think it dismisses the Q hypothesis. The other issue is that I think Mark's indebtedness to the Q document is far greater than we usually know. And even the people who hold to the modified Q document hypothesis do not use Mark for reconstructing the Q document. In some cases, I think we need to. I think that the Mark is one of our most valuable and certainly the earliest witness that we have to the Q document. So in order to use those criteria, I've spent a career trying to catch up on those shipwreck gospels that one of my books talks about. That's the Q document. The other is to reconstruct what we can from Papias's exposition of Logi about the Lord. Now, I would have to say that my hypothesis is not welcome to traditional advocates of the true document hypothesis. It's a little more warmly received by those who hold to a modified version of it. But it also is not welcomed by the far hypothesis, because it still insists that there's a Q document that can be
2 minutes.
Reasonably restored. Well, I'll let Bruce take those 2 minutes. That's my summary.
All right, Bruce.
Many thanks, Dennis. I think that's a clear exposition of the kind of consideration that has gone into understanding the relationship among the Gospels, and of course, in particular, to your own approach. Personally, I welcome the acknowledgement of, let us say at the very least, the close affinity between Mark and Q. I have sometimes gone back to the remark of B.H. Streeter in his book, The Four Gospels, when he said that the overlap between Mark and Q is more certain than the existence of Q. That is, that there are influences which Streeter acknowledged he had difficulty explaining on his strictly documentary hypothesis. And from my own point of view, the strictness of a documentary hypothesis always runs into difficulty. So that attempts to say that the Gospels can be fully explained on the basis of one Gospel's use of another, as if it were a matter of scribal adaptation. These efforts have not been well received. And to some extent, it was because of that the existence of Q during the 19th century came increasingly to be embraced. And then when British scholarship accepted it in the early 20th century, I think it resulted in what Dennis rightly refers to by this stage as a traditional view, the two document hypothesis, that is Mark and Q. My difficulty with the two document hypothesis is its insistence on documents always being the solution to any possible relationship among the Gospels. I, in fact, take the view that there is not a synoptic problem. It is just that we have three Gospels that can be compared with one another, and their incomplete identity is actually an opportunity that permits us to understand better each of them. I think we will never understand all of the influences on a given gospel, although I don't find any difficulty whatever in accepting the view that there can be mutual use, owing to the nature of communication in the Mediterranean basin during this period. And much of that involves an acknowledgement of the importance of an oral environment. That oral environment is vital for understanding the movement around Jesus in its earliest phase, in a different language from the Gospels, Aramaic instead of Greek. But it's also important within the development of the Greek Gospels in themselves, since they do not emerge in an oral vacuum. They emerge in an environment in which we can, I think rather plainly see influences of allusion to then classical literature. I mean, I myself think it most unlikely that when Paul recounts his own conversion experience, most unlikely he actually alluded to Euripides' play The Bacchae, which is how Acts portrays him in chapter 26. But the point is, in telling that story, it added to the verisimilitude of what was said to include that representation. That, to my mind, is an example of how something in a literary tradition is actually circulated in an oral form and then influences the development of the New Testament, in this case, the book of Acts. So my concern is actually to get away from the assumption that identifying specific documents is our best approach to the way in which the Gospels emerged. It seems to me that the most formative influences were speakers who shaped the traditions regarding Jesus, first of all orally, and then over the course of time in written form, uh, whether a tradition such as Q had made the transition from Aramaic to Greek prior to the Gospels, we can't actually know, though I personally think they probably did. It seems to me the fit is close enough as to suggest that. And because it seems to me that this is the case, some time ago, I simply made a comparison between the way in which individual passages in the Gospels relate to one another and the way in which passages relate to one another in a literature which we know rather securely was oral in origin and eventually came into writing, namely rabbinic literature. And so I compared, for example, the story of Jesus' teaching in regard to divorce and a dispute involving Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai on how to count the number of Levites in the book of Judges, because there's two passages totally unrelated in terms of content, are nonetheless they occupy a similar number of repetitions in their respective literatures. And when I did that, I looked at the two kinds of story, the one rabbinic, the other in the New Testament, and I compared them in terms of their length, the words they used, and their syntax, always assigning a numerical value to those, and then coming up with a global comparison. And when I did that, what I discovered is that you're dealing with an order of variation which is quite similar within rabbinic literature as compared to what we find in the Synoptic Gospels. In both cases, the average degree of variation was approximately 48%. Actually, interestingly, much less high than sometimes people say. People sometimes give the impression of an exact correspondence from one gospel to another. That is rather rarely the case. So this approach to the development of the material by means of an appreciation of oral tradition, not only as it were at the beginning point, but also during the process of the emergence,
2 minutes, Bruce.
as a way in which we might be able to use the scholarship of the past, but reframe it into a model that corresponds better to Mediterranean communication as we presently understand it.
Are you waiving the remaining time?
Yes, I'm happy to
Okay.
waive that.
Okay. Dennis, you want to do a 5-minute response?
What I'd like to do, Jacob, if it's okay, is engage Bruce right away in some questions,
Okay.
so I have a little more clarity about this.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
You mentioned the Bacchae and the
Mhm.
Acts of the Apostles. That's a very good example. But of course, that reference doesn't appear in Gospels as such, unless you think Luke Acts is a Gospel, which I do.
Exactly. Yeah, actually, right. It belongs to the larger edition. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with any of my work about the influence of the Homeric epics on the Gospels? And
I am.
if so,
Yes.
And
Mhm.
if so, do you have a judgment about that?
I think that I would apply a similar model to accounting for influences that I think you have helpfully identified, as I would to that usage from the Bacchae. Now, of course, there's a discussion about that usage from the Bacchae. Is the statement about kicking against the goads actually from the Bacchae, or was it already proverbial?
Oh, yeah, I understand. Yeah, right.
Here's right. We said, as in all of these cases, making a direct assertion of influence is always going to be subject to discussion, and so this has been as well. The fact, nonetheless, I think remains that readers familiar with Euripides certainly would have heard the allusion.
That's right. In fact, we know that they did. Yeah, some
Yeah.
did. Yeah.
Exactly. When they heard that section from the book of Acts. Similarly, not within the Synoptic Gospels, but within the Gospel according to John, when Jesus speaks of eating the flesh of the Son of Man and drinking his blood, I find it very difficult not to see an allusion to the place of Dionysus within the Mediterranean.
There you go. Yeah, there you go.
Especially because Dionysus is an extremely prominent figure in the art historical remains of that period.
And actually, in the reception of the Gospel of John, we know that there was an epic that was written on the paraphrase of the Gospel of John by Nonus of Panopolis in the 5th century. And then we have lots of examples of it. Now, I'm going to identify, and you don't need to respond to this because I think we'll be talking about it again. I don't think that appeal to oral tradition helps not a bit in understanding the synoptic problem. And I also am very leery about the use of rabbinics in order as an analogy for understanding. And so I've gone so far as to say that I don't think Mark has knows any tradition whatsoever about Jesus that he didn't inherit from the Logoi of Jesus. So I know that's going to be a place where we're really going to have to help our listeners make some assessments, because we're going to be very different on that question. I think that the business of the Homeric epics really does shed light on the synoptic problem, and we can talk about that at a different time. Jacob, those are the big questions I would have for Bruce, just as a way of setting up where we would have some rub against each other.
Yes, I think that's very, very helpful. I have long encountered, and I have to say, especially on the West Coast, the understanding that rabbinic literature should not be of any use for the understanding of the Gospels, with which, of course, I disagree. I just brought out a volume with Alan Avery Peck in which we edited the material, and we have individual authors dealing with individual documents of both the Targumim, the translations of the Bible into Aramaic, and also classic rabbinic literature, Mishnah, Tosefta, Talmud, in which we also discussed the number of cases in which connections with the New Testament have been a matter of discussion for some time. So it is a field. It is something that I think deserves attention. And just as Greco-Roman materials from the 5th century and later can indeed be of relevance for an understanding of the Gospels, that can also be the case when we're dealing with rabbinic literature, especially because we are now dealing with a situation that is different from the time that you and I first met in connection with the Jesus Seminar, when it concerns the study of Aramaic. The difference that has been made is that the Aramaic remains from Qumran have now, not completely, but largely been assimilated into linguistic analysis. It's part of a project known as the Comprehensive Aramaic Lexicon, which has involved literally hundreds of scholars around the world. It was organized out of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati by Steve Kaufman, who did a wonderful job. And it was just announced at an Aramaic conference I was attending in Amsterdam a couple of weeks ago that the Free University in Amsterdam will be taking over that whole project and giving it a new platform. The great advantage of it is that you can today enter into this extraordinary lexicon that actually gives results according to periods of time. That is, it assesses words by their chronological appearance in dialects. And in the course of doing that, one can also see the connections that there are between rabbinic literature and what we know to be first century Aramaic usages, because they appear at Qumran and in associated finds. Because that material has become available, I in fact recently looked at the Gospel according to Mark again and did a tabulation of all the cases where he uses an Aramaic word with translation or uses an Aramaic word without a translation. But the point is, he does so more than any other of the synoptic Gospels. Though interestingly, some of these things then became slogans, so we can see them appearing in the Gospel according to John, and sometimes being used in a duplicative way. So we have. Sorry, go ahead.
Jacob, I want your viewers to know that that kind of research in Aramaic is extremely valuable and overdue. And I'm going to ask Bruce a couple of questions about that research, but I am not poo-pooing that kind of research at all. In fact, I understand myself to be a philologian, but mostly in Greek and Latin. So, but that kind of philology, it is, Jacob, that is such difficult work. You've got to know not only Aramaic, you need to know Hebrew, you need to know to some Greek and Latin, because you have those languages then imitated. In the Gospel of Mark, you actually have some puns on Aramaic words. So there's no doubt that Mark is expecting at least some of his audience, and then maybe most of them, to be bilingual.
Right. I think he is, but I think also sometimes Mark has no idea. You know, that, I mean, for example, sometimes he comes up with an Aramaic translation which makes no sense whatever.
Like Boanerges.
Yeah, exactly. What is that supposed to be?
But, you know, there's another one that I want to say, Delmanutha. Delmanutha, probably, it probably is a neologism created from of the harbor, a city of the harbor. And the Homeric image of that is a harbor story. So I don't think that Aramaic and Homeric information is counterproductive. I think it actually is symbiotic.
Right, exactly. They're not, and that's an important observation, because there has been a very strong tendency in gospel criticism to approach it either from the point of view of Hellenistic sources or from the point of view of Semitic sources. And that's clearly a problem. I mean, the great body of Second Temple Judaic resources, which make it into wonderful Greek, is a clear indication that trying to keep a kind of wall of separation between these cultures is very much an artifact of modern study.
And the same thing happens in Q studies, because Q has Aramaic loanwords.
Yeah,
and,
no question.
There may be, and in fact, when Papias talks about Matthew, he's talking about a Hebrew Aramaic Matthew that he thinks then comes over into Greek, and he doesn't know there is no Hebrew Matthew, but he sees in the Greek translations evidence of Aramaic. So I'm not poo-pooing this business about Aramaic importance. The question is, how much leverage does it give us to the synoptic problem? And that's probably where we would we'd weigh the evidence somewhat differently, I think.
Yeah, that could be the case. I mean, from my point of view, the usage of Aramaic is a possible indication of where in the present form of the synoptic gospels there has been an influence of a stream of tradition whose origin was Aramaic. This
Yeah.
strikes me as especially likely when the current gospel writer in Greek includes it, but doesn't represent any understanding of it.
No, that's fair enough. But I just have one question for you. I know that Jacob is grabbing his microphone, so I'm going to turn it over to him.
Sounds good.
My question.
I was just pulling
this
it
question-
closer.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, this question is just very simple. And I'll give you a background to it.
Mhm.
Frequently, in the history of language, archaic words survive best in names and not in other kinds of more popular speech. Has this project been interested in how names function and how stable the Aramaic names are from period to period, and if they bleed over into Greek?
For that kind of work, I actually rely less on the comprehensive Aramaic lexicon because it is more interested linguistically in their entries. For names, I've really benefited from the work of Tal Ilan, which represents a remarkable encyclopedic collection of both Semitic and Greek forms and sometimes Latin forms, so that you can see them traveling right the way through the Byzantine period.
Well, and you can, but you see this New Testament, don't you, including the Acts of the Apostles, where many of the Aramaic words are actually names that
Exactly.
sometimes get translated and sometimes don't, and
sometimes
sometimes they get translated poorly.
That, like
So-
Barnabua, in what universe does Barnabua mean "son of consolation"? I mean, it's difficult.
Yeah, no, that's right. So, so I think we're on the same page, we're closer on the same page that way, because I really do think that Aramaic sticks around in the memory of early Christians when, Cephas or whatever. And you can see it's still is there, even though the translation is botched.
Is botched, right? And the very fact that name holds on.
That's right.
And that we find Paul using it, and its interchangeability with Petros is really quite interesting, and is, I think, one marker that he was recalled, amongst other things, as an Aramaic tradent. I think also sometimes words, it's exactly true, and this is often said not in respect so much of the synoptic gospels as of John's gospel. Sometimes John's gospel seems just to use a term from Aramaic because it makes it all more vivid. It doesn't translate it. It's pretty inert. It might be accurate, but it's just a case of reminiscence. But when you remember what Jesus said when he raised the daughter of the synagogue ruler, or
Kalakumi.
exactly, or when there's an issue of how at moments where we know that there are ancient Christian practices of healing and exorcism where either direct Aramaic phrases or the influence of Aramaic may be discerned, that to me suggests one reason for holding on to them within the oral tradition was to engage in these same practices.
That's possible. I want to switch back to Q if I could. Jacob, is that
sure.
okay? Yeah,
Sure.
Jacob, are you okay?
I think we should. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to raise two issues that for me are important, and I wonder if you've thought about them too. And this is where your interest in rabbinics can be insightful, in my view. We know that one of the great debates among the rabbis, both before and after the war, was how strictly to enforce Torah.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have Shammai and Hillel as the big examples of the different streams. So I just want to keep that in mind for a moment. I'm suspicious, and in fact, verge on being dogmatic, that the Q document, at least as I reconstruct it, was not written by someone that we would know as a Christian, but rather as a radical Jew who was concerned that Pharisees were overly strict in the application of Torah, so that tax collectors and prostitutes and other sinners and so on could not be considered in the family of Israel, something like that. And so it's a kind of radical Hillelism that I think might be there. And I can see why Christians would glom onto that controversy and favor a group that was challenging Pharisees and nomikoi, other nomos enforcers, because they have their own issues with Pharisees and chief priests, and later chief priests and so on. And I have found that both in not scholars like us, but among people about whom I talk about Q and the Gospels, both Jews and Christians and people like myself who are atheists don't like that idea that you could have a Jewish intellectual who liked Jesus. And I just think that's an unfortunate. I can see how that would work for the movement of Christian discourse into Jewish discourse and tradition into the Christian movement, but it's not welcome in various circles. I wonder if you'd had that experience yourself.
I have. There's an interesting ambivalence in regard to understanding the Judaic origin of Jesus and his movement. And I think the ambivalence is that understanding it more clearly does appear to be a kind of powerful defense against many forms of Christian anti-Semitism, although not all the forms, but against many forms of it. But then, on the other hand, one doesn't want Jesus to become too Jewish, because then he winds up offering an alternative. But alas, I just have to tell, and this was part of my long-standing discussion with Jacob Neusner, I think that we are dealing with a distinctive form of Second Temple Judaism.
That's right. Yeah.
When we consider Jesus and the earliest part of his movement, which understood itself preeminently in prophetic terms. And if you take your center of gravity within the understanding of the Hebrew Bible as being the prophets, such that you don't read the prophets through the Torah, it's more the reverse. The result of that is that you can see the kinds of changes that are attributed to Jesus. And it strikes me that when you're dealing with this collection of sayings that we call Q, but we always have to remind ourselves was never called Q until the 19th century, that this collection of sayings does, I think, focus on the issue of the kingdom of God in a way that I think shows that reflects not only the position of Jesus, I think it does, but also of his followers. So that I think that in this collection of material, they were filling out what they had of Jesus' memory, of the recollection of his teachings. Since for a rabbi, he died at an extremely young age. I mean, if it was anywhere near 30, that's, before you've been able to frame your instruction into what would be called at the time a Mishnah, not the Mishnah, but a Mishnah, because every decent rabbi had one. And so I think what they were doing was filling out and making possible, extending his teaching, so that this core concept of the kingdom could be developed in a variety of ways: how to speak about it, how to act for it, how to encounter others who may accept you or resist you, what your authority is, and how this is to be continued after his death. I think all of those questions are implicit in the organization of the material we call Q. And of course, this group would not have described itself as Christian.
No, absolutely not.
They would not. I mean, they don't live in Antioch around the year 45.
Well, this is one of the places where I think Matthew actually is the only one who retains a Q saying, because he has to reverse it later on. Do not go to Gentiles or Samaritans, go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, that's not going to be congenial to the Christians who are interested in the Gentile mission. And so that has to be changed, and Matthew changes it.
Changed it, and tells you, right, and tells you when it's changed.
That's right, exactly.
Puts it in the setting of the resurrection, so that what he told them, don't go into the way of the Gentiles, is exactly reversed.
In the Great Commission, that's what you're talking about. Yeah,
right,
yeah,
you're supposed to make disciples of all nations.
Exactly. So he inherits something from Q and has to reverse it. There are some other examples we could look at. Actually, I'm interested in getting Jacob in the discussion. He's an authority in both Judaism and in early Christianity, and I'm sure he's got some thoughts.
Well, thanks. I guess I'll just throw in, when you look at Matthew and Luke, how does one confidently tell that something is more primitive than the other? Because some can have different opinions on that.
Can I address that first, Bruce?
Sure, please go right ahead.
Because I think Bruce will probably add to this list, but these are the ones that I think are most important. When one finds two sayings that are similar to each other, in fact, they can be identical wording for this one criterion. If one is embedded in a narrative and the other is standalone, the one that's standalone is probably more primitive, because we know of the practice of creating kriai from gnomi, that is maxims. And so if you have a maxim, that can be then the punchline of your kreia. So you set up an anecdote where Jesus or somebody, again, could be Aesop, is talking to someone and then throws in this zinger. So that would be one criterion, is if you find two similar sayings and one is contextualized in a kreia or an anecdote and the other stands alone, that gives the nod modestly to one. Another is that usually scribalism moves in the direction of correcting problems rather than creating them. And this can be even as small as grammatical mistakes. But often it has to do with a smudge on Jesus's character that gets removed in the next one, even though it's a similar saying. So I talk about the movement from the more difficult reading, and this is textual criticism, the more difficult reading more likely is the earlier, because the direction usually scribally is in improvement. The third one that I'm going to use is what I would call the differences between typicality and atypicality. That is, and Bruce has been actually a pioneer in this, as I recall. One is that Matthew has a distinctive vocabulary. The kingdom of heaven would be a good example. But we know some of his concerns. And frequently we will find, and I'll give you one example in a moment, we can find a Matthean typicality in a saying that has an equivalent in Luke. But the same thing happens with Luke. Luke has his own typicalities. He tends to be grammatically in Greek somewhat more elegant. And when we can find these typicalities, the typicalities usually are secondary to atypicalities, so that if we find something in a text of a saying that sticks out and is not characteristic of the author, then we're going to think that that's more primitive. We'll just give you one example. The famous so-called Lord's Prayer, which really is a disciple's prayer. He's not praying it, he's asking people to do it. You have, just as it begins in Luke, you have Father. Matthew, our Father who art in heaven. That's so typically Matthean that that doesn't mean that that saying comes from Q. But if you're talking about reverse priority, Luke's got the winner on that one. So I think most criteria that scholars use, whether it's articulated that way or it's intuitive, falls into one of those categories. And Bruce, I'd be interested in knowing what criteria you might use in making those judgments.
Yeah, I would largely agree with those. I would point out in the first one that the appreciation of the importance of narrative and how you can nest teaching within a narrative may also be expressed on the Semitic side by seeing the importance of Haggadah. And
voila.
As it were, Haggadah is the equivalent of Kreya from this point of view. And so I think that one can frequently find instances in which a saying is embedded within a narrative context, but that narrative context may give the saying a new meaning. And for that reason, that act of embedding has to be looked at critically. And if we are in a position where we have a other gospel without that embedding, it's a great help. Although I'd also want to call attention to the importance of associating sayings, which can also have the impact of giving them a spin which they wouldn't otherwise have. And sometimes that associative spin doesn't really sit very easily with the saying in itself. And yes, the principle of the difficult reading, I think, does apply. If there is an assertion that doesn't accord with the overall representation of Jesus within a gospel, then we ought to take that more seriously. And this really, it shades into this issue of what you call typicality. And as you say, yeah, I was interested in that, in the whole issue of the use of redaction criticism in understanding how gospels are, especially Matthew in this regard. I mean, Matthew really likes to present Jesus saying things in the same way, sometimes in a highly formulaic representation.
Yeah, and there's one other criterion I could ask. That is, I didn't mention sequencing, and that is sometimes a saying is so native to a sequence in one gospel and seems so forced into another that I think what I would call the most native narrative sequence is another criterion.
Another way, yeah. And my overall aim in this is to try to see what the most natural and logical trajectory is.
Yes, of course.
If I can understand how it unfolds through the tradition, even better if I've got 3 gospels or even 4 involved, that then also permits us more accurately to look at the question of, all right, now, is it possible for us also to understand what generated this?
That's right. Sure.
Would we be able to make that move? Yeah. So the whole work is a work of inference, but it's a work of inference that you referred to earlier as scientific, and I would agree with that. There is such a thing as scientific inference.
So, Jacob, that was a great question. It really got us going. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. Yeah, there's a couple of more questions I want to ask, and a super chat I want to take before we close. The first being, is it possible that sometimes what one imagines to be the result of Matthew and Luke's independent use of Q turns out it's because one got it from the other, because we can't know all the absolute content of what's in Q?
Do you want me to start, Bruce, or do you want to take that?
I'd be happy either way. Yep.
The way that I would deal with it is going to be really minute and tricky. In most cases, when you have sayings that are similar to each other, especially parables or something like that are longer, the issue is not simply this one's earlier than that.
Right.
The issue is, does this have earlier material in it than that? And in other cases, does the other gospel have material that's more primitive, in which case you probably do have it generated from a common source. So the issue isn't to say this verse comes from Luke and it doesn't come from Matthew, or this one comes from Matthew, it doesn't come from Luke. Almost always it's a mixed bag. And so I'm sure that Bruce has run out of blue and red pencils the same way I have.
Exactly.
Because you look at the Greek text and then you're trying to decide almost word for word which ones seem to be most native to or earlier, and where you have that. And this is one reason why scholars scramble so much over the Q document, and it's not scissors in paste. You can't just go, this verse goes here and this verse goes there. It really is much more sophisticated than that. And I would say that's because these are sophisticated authors. We need to understand them as not as scribes, but as artists, as well as scribes. And they're using their own creativity. So your question's a very good one. I wish we could have a blotter and to take everything that comes from Matthew out of the Lucan parallels, but you can't do that.
Doesn't work. Yeah. No, I think that's right. And in addition to there being a sophistication on the part of those who are assembling these traditions in regard to Jesus, there's also a sophistication on the part of the audiences involved. So as the Gospels are being produced, I take it in different cities of the Mediterranean world, they are not completely isolated from people who live elsewhere who are familiar with a different gospel, some of which we know, no doubt some of which we don't know. And because from the point of view of the audience, the gospel is always an oral work, right? Because it is declared. It is made aloud. Many of those in the congregation, although sophisticated in the sense of oral culture, are also illiterate. So when it's possible for them to hear a alternative version, which may come from another gospel, that is likely to have an impact. I was just working on some materials for a class next week on the Didache, and again came across that reference to the way in which traveling prophets come into congregations and need to be dealt with as a factor. I think part of that factor simply had to do with, yes, ethical instruction, with issues of practice, no doubt, but it also had to do with how you went about understanding this material in regard to Jesus. It was a highly diverse environment in which the Gospels were produced.
So my second question, it is for both of you. I would like each of you to give your best argument, or not really your best argument. Let me rephrase. More like what I mean is, what do you think is like that stands out? What do you think that stands out the most for each of you on the reasons that each of you believe that either Luke knew Matthew or didn't know Matthew? So Dennis, for instance, what gives you the greatest confidence that Luke knew Matthew? And Bruce, what gives you the greatest confidence that Luke and Matthew most likely didn't know each other?
Well, for me, and only for me, I think the testimony of Papias is most important. And I say that not just because Papias doesn't seem to know Luke, but he also knows it to Matthew's, and he wants to restore Matthew's syntaxis, his taxis, his sequence of things. And there are two places where I think Papias and Luke overlap in ways that are quite remarkable, and there are a number of modest ones. So very quickly, the prologue of the Gospel of Luke is many have undertaken to write a diegesis among us, an exposition among us. And it seemed good for me to do so and to put it in order for you, Theophilus, so that you may know the truth of the logoi that you have been taught. This is what Papias is about. Papias has these multiple gospels. John the Elder has informed him of it, and he's trying to get them in the same taxis. Why? Because he wants his patron to know the reliability of what he's saying. Another is Matthew's death of Judas is a suicide. Papias's death of Judas is divine punishment that have his bowels gushing out. And Luke's version is closer to Papias's, but it also knows Matthew's. It's a conflation of these stories. I think that's fascinating. But here is something else. In Luke and in Papias, we find the earliest references to the daughters of Philip. In both of them, we have the deaths of John and Jacob, or James and John. In both of them, we have a man named either Barsabbas Justus or Justus Barsabbas. In both of them, we have a narrative that extends after Jesus' resurrection to take into what is happening to Jesus' followers afterwards. Now, I know those are not compelling to everyone. In fact, there are people who have argued against it. No, the parallels come from not from Luke's knowledge of Papias, but Papias's knowledge of Luke, and then they have to explain why Eusebius doesn't mention that, and yada, yada, yada. But I'm just telling you what makes sense to me, that I think. But the other, and I don't know how Bruce would talk about this very briefly, there are places where Matthew and Luke's infancy narratives overlap quite remarkably. And usually Q scholars debunk those and say, no, that they really don't qualify for Q. I think they qualify pretty well for Luke's knowledge of Matthew. And to some extent, you could say the same thing with the resurrection story. In both, the women do tell. In both of them, you have appearances and a kind of instead of the Great Commission, you have the Ascension speech by Jesus in Acts and so on. So I think there's plenty of reason to think that Luke knew Matthew. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that he didn't also know another gospel. So that's my little deal.
Yeah, exactly. And he does, I think Luke does indicate in that prologue that he knows a range of traditions
Exactly.
that he wishes to reflect.
Exactly.
And
That's right.
that is very much my own point of departure. And in the work of doing that, what occurs is a term you use, Dennis, which I think is very helpful. That is that of conflation. When we become aware over time of differing traditions, the adjudication among those traditions does not occur on the basis of the same kind of priorities that we have when we're reading the material. And as a result of that, let's take the example of the resurrection story. Even when there can be an evidence of some conflation of similar material, whether directly or indirectly, the result is nonetheless, substantially speaking, a distinctive representation of what the events were, where they occurred, and who the principal people involved were. Similarly, the birth stories, the more it is clear that there is a traditional connection among the birth stories, the more it's fascinating that they wind up so different in terms of their substance. I mean, that to me is part of the excitement of becoming aware of how the coalescence of traditions is in fact creatively handled within the community.
I have an answer to that one. I think Luke is using the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite as for the annunciations to Zechariah and Mary and to the shepherds. And Virgil uses that to establish the dynasty of Aeneas in the Aeneid. And I think Luke is already setting the reader up to see his founding myth to be an alternative founding myth to the Aeneid. I'll give you some example of that later on.
Okay, that sounds good. But I would say that such influences have their place. I'm not in any way denying them. What I would caution is that being aware of an influence does not make it the sole influence.
No, absolutely. And these are eclectic influences.
Yeah,
and in fact, we know that that's how people were taught in school.
Yes,
is
exactly.
To avoid plagiarism, you use eclecticism. And the image that's used is like a bee that goes to lots of flowers to connect pollen in order to make honey. You don't want to have a bee going to just one flower.
Yep, just so.
So I'm going to take the super chat question.
Okay.
Adia Morgenstern, thank you for your super chat. Dennis, you mentioned the other day that you and Mark Bilby have some differences in your reconstructions of Q. Have you read his 5 hypotheses to recover and restore the first gospel? And if so, what, if anything, do you find issues with?
Good to hear from you again, Adia. That's also a very good question. I haven't read Mark on Q for several years, so I'm going to be unfortunately coy about my answer to it. I think Mark has some issues with traditional Q reconstructions and mine. And what I find to be most disturbing about what I remember is his attitude to the Gospel of Marcion. And because there's a movement now to say that the Marcion Gospel is the earliest version of Luke, and some have said it's the earliest Gospel we have in a New Testament, and others have said it's earlier than Q. And Mark is toying with how to hold together a version of Mimesis criticism and the priority of Marcion's gospel. And I just think, Adia, that's a mistake. That's not to say that the research on the gospel of Marcion is not worthwhile. It is very worthwhile, and it's quite fascinating. The question is, how far back in the tradition can you take Marcion's gospel? Or do you have to see it as a truncated version of the canonical gospel? And so I think Mark is getting his tail twisted a little bit by trying to have his Q and Marcion too. And as I recall, the 5 criteria he uses, they really are quite arcane and not even very accessible to scholars like myself. But that may be unfair, and I hope maybe to see Mark and get that sorted through. But I think at some point we need to decide, where does the Marcion gospel stand in the transmission of Luke? And how seriously do we want to take its priority?
And Audio says here, I think you should actually read Mark Bilby's introduction because he's not arguing for Marcion priority.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I do remember him telling me that he puts a proto-Mark before Marcion's gospel. He thinks Marcion's gospel is 2/3 Mark, 1/3 Q. I believe it's something that he said to me. So that's where he's at. He's got a proto-Mark being earlier than Marcion's.
No, you know more about it than I do. Then, yeah.
So Dennis, did you want to elaborate on what you were saying to Bruce earlier about the hymn to Aphrodite before we close?
I'm going to tell you the basic story of the hymn to Aphrodite very briefly, and I'm going to let you and Bruce tell me what this sounds like. Zeus wants to trick his daughter Aphrodite, the love goddess, into having sex with a mortal man. And Anchises, the beautiful Trojan, is out taking care of his flocks alone. Aphrodite comes to him as a beautiful woman, but a mortal woman. And Anchises says, "Oh, you must be a goddess. I'd better behave myself here." And she says, "Oh, no, I'm just a mortal. Don't have to worry about me. There's nothing to fear. Do not fear." So then they make love. And after making love, she says, "Bub, I am a goddess. And I will birth you a son. And he will have a dynasty that will never end. And you will call his name Aeneas, because I suffered pain in making love to a mortal. And Bub, if you ever tell anybody that you slept with me, my father Zeus is going to kick your ass." And so what do we have in the Gospel Annunciation stories? An angel appears. There's fear. There's a statement, "Fear not." There's a statement to Mary that you will birth a son and he will have an eternal dynasty, right? An angel appears to shepherds in a field, and he's surrounded then by an army of angels and says, "Do not fear, and I'm going to declare peace to the world." This is all about Aeneas and Augustus and so on. It really is so damn clever. So I think this usually, and I know Bruce is familiar with this issue, going back to Raymond Brown and others who have seen the Annunciation stories in the Hebrew Bible, of which there are 3, as the models for this. And I think it is the model for Matthew. But I think Luke sees that as also an invitation to the enunciations that appear in the Greco-Roman world. And he's going to apply it to Aeneas. And Bruce, I don't know anyone that's written this up and published it. But the parallels are really quite striking.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's the story.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a helpful story, beautifully told, I must say. Some of it, of course, has to do with the nature of coming across an angel. And there is a kind of duplication of the issues of that kind of engagement, I think, but what I do find particularly interesting is Luke's sometimes subterranean interest in how it is that Rome itself should be represented within the development of the gospel, and then particularly in the book of Acts. And because he has that political engagement, and because he dedicates the work to Theophilus, whoever precisely that was or was not, I think that's an implication that he, in telling the story, may well have had these allusions in mind. That is, I don't see them as generative, but as allusive.
Just a little funny little note. Augustus called himself Divi Filius,
right? Mm-hmm.
Of the God Son.
Mm-hmm.
Theophilus begins with Theos, Divi, and it's Philos, not Filius.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think that Luke is winking to the reader to see this as a play on the Divi Filius, but I can't prove it, and so we'll see.
Well, thank you both for joining me. This was a wonderful debate. We should.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
We should do a part two, like more of a discussion later, and continue this.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.